Invite you all to the panel, or welcome you all to the panel on gender expression and trans rights in Ontario. I'm really excited about the presentations we're about to hear. I just want to pass the mic to Keisha Monroe for a moment because there's an announcement that she wanted to make.
Hi everyone, this will be really quick. I forgot to mention in the last room that if anyone is triggered today or feels the need to speak to a counselor, we'll have a counselor on hand all day. You can approach an organizer and we'll have one to you within 2 minutes or so. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Ryder.
So we have three amazing speakers with us today to address the recent developments in trans rights and people who have been very involved in the struggle for the recognition and fulfillment of trans rights. And this is, of course, a wonderful time to be talking about this issue because there have been so many recent victories to celebrate, including the passage of the bill last year in Ontario, Bill 33, that added gender identity and gender expression as new prohibited grounds of discrimination to the Ontario Human Rights Code. And it's never easy to add new grounds of discrimination to the Human Rights Code. It doesn't happen very often. I think the last time was with the addition of sexual orientation back in the early 90s or the late 80s. I forget exactly when it was, but it was about 20 years ago, right? 86, was it, Sherry?
Yeah.
So this is the first time since then, quarter century later. And normally, when new grounds are fought and struggled for, there's a fierce resistance to their inclusion, and all kinds of arguments are raised and aired that really demonstrate the need to add this ground of discrimination to the code. And it takes a lot of perseverance and patience and belief in the struggle, and I think Sherry's career is probably proof you stick around long enough and fight hard enough, you're eventually going to achieve some very important victories. So we have about 15 minutes each for the speakers, and then we have hopefully significant time for your comments and questions. And we have some mobile microphones in the room that I'll be zipping around to you and hope that we'll have a chance to hear from you and get a good conversation going. So you have the bios of the speakers in the conference brochure. I don't think I need to bore you by reading them, and you may already be familiar with all of our speakers. In any case, let me just say that Sherry DeNovo is, of course, the MPP for Parkdale High Park and a leader in the NDP caucus. Morgan Page is currently the Trans Community Services Coordinator at the 519 Church Street Community Center. And Martine Stonehouse is the Vice Chair of the Trans Lobby Group, which has done such terrific work in this area. And she successfully launched and fought the human rights case against the Ministry of Health over the delisting of funding for sex reassignment surgery that led to the Hogan versus Ontario landmark decision back in 2006 from the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. She was one of the three applicants in that case. So a pretty special panel we have lined up. Sherry's going to speak first, followed by Martine, and then Morgan. Sherry.
Thank you. Is this on? This doesn't really need to be. Anyway, I thought I'd give a little bit of a backdrop to Toby's Act, which is Toby's Law, which is Bill 33. It passed in its fourth tabling. It was tabled 3 other times. I tabled it the very first year I was elected. I'm in my 7th year now. And Toby's Law is built on a real person named Toby Dancer. Before I was elected as a political representative, I was a United Church minister. And in my church, Toby Dancer was our music director. Toby came in as a man, left as a woman, and Toby wasn't alone in that. We had actually been the church for the very first trans United Church minister ordained, any clergy person ordained as a trans person in Canada. As well, Cindy Bourgeois, who's now, I think, last I heard from her, she's out in Stratford with a church in Stratford, Ontario. So that church was a pretty special place. It was also the place a few years before Toby walked in where we performed the first legalized same-sex marriage. People ask, what does that mean? Well, Brent Hawkes at MCC did a marriage by banns, but it was not made legal because the law hadn't changed at that point. So we took our cue from Brent and performed a marriage by banns of 2 women in my church, and because on the old marriage application didn't say anything about male and female, just bride and groom, we submitted it to the Registrar General, and they vetted it by mistake. They thought one of the names, Paula, was a man. And then they threatened to take away my license to perform marriages, and Doug Elliott and the CBC fought and won my license back. So, and then shortly thereafter, the law changed, so we were all in the clear. So that's a little bit of the backdrop of who Toby is. The backdrop legislatively, which is of interest, I think, to law students, is that this was the fourth tabling of the bill. It was the first tabling of the bill where we had each party sign on to the bill. And I'm kind of the queen of the tri-party bill at the Ontario legislature. And I have to tell you, we're unique in that. We're the only province in Canada that has done this and done it consistently, and the first to do it historically. The first was a bill that I signed on with the other two parties for to recognize that what happened in the Holodomor in Ukraine was genocide, so to name it as such. And then after, we had a few other bills that we did tri-party. They were mostly kind of motherhood bills, you know. I think one was Jewish Heritage Month. Who's going to argue with that? That kind of thing, where all parties could come together and just facilitated the process of getting a bill passed. Didn't make it, you know, necessary or absolute, because they're still only private members' bills. They're not government bills, so we still had some negotiating to do, but it made it that much easier. So it was a real step forward when we were able to get both Christine Elliott of the Conservative Party and Yasser Naqvi of the Liberal Party to sign on to this bill. That is, to co-author it. Same bill that I tabled on my own before, but this time with the addition of the two other parties. When we think about Christine Elliott's signature on that bill, it's pretty significant. First of all, I always say we're, in Canada, always a kinder and gentler nation than our neighbors to the south. But can you imagine a Republican ever signing such a bill? Never. And who's married to Jim Flaherty, the Minister of Finance for the country, who also voted for the federal bill. Again, can you imagine a Republican Minister of Finance in the States signing on to anything like this? Never. So it gives you a sense of the different in which we operate in Canada, which is much better, I think. So anyway, that helped. That helped, because when it came time to passing bills in a minority government, this became sort of pick of the pops. And the pressure was on to pass it before Pride. The committee hearings were very brief, unlike the GSA bill, which was drag them out in a horrible process, where every homophobe in Ontario got to come and depute. This was very fast, very seamless, and explains why we got both gender identity and gender expression. To date, we're the only jurisdiction, I believe, in North America that has that. I haven't been told to the contrary. So we really have set the standard, not only for North America, I think for the world, with that legislation where trans human rights are concerned. I have to, of course, give credit to the trans lobby, of which Martine is a member, and Susan Gapka, who couldn't be here today. Just tireless advocates and lobbyists. I've always said the best lobbyists. It shows you don't have to have money. You don't have to fet politicians with, you know, big shrimp and white wine. You can just be persistent and keep hammering at the doors, and that sometimes makes all the difference, and that's certainly what the trans lobby did. Was there resistance to the bill? Yes, there was. Dramatic resistance, actually, and surprising dramatic resistance to me. Thought we were past that, but apparently not. In my riding, a group of fundamentalist Christians who have a political wing ran around my riding with full-color pamphlets with my face on them, saying that I was the author of the bathroom bill. The bathroom bill, that moniker, has been kind of dogging the federal bill as well. It's a concerted effort by mainly the Christian right, although there's been a bit of a pile-on from other fundamentalist groups, saying that this bill would allow men dressing up as women to enter women's bathrooms, girls' bathrooms in schools and locker rooms. You've heard, I mean, most of you are not old enough to know, but I'm old enough to know that 25 years ago, when sexual expression was added, we heard the same things. We heard this will turn pedophiles loose in our classrooms. Those are the kinds of arguments that we heard back then too. So some things don't change. So perhaps I'll leave it at that and just say I think it was a kind of minor miracle that this bill passed as seamlessly and easily as it did. And of course, took a lot of work and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from a lot of people for many years. But at the end, it kind of clicked for a number of unique political reasons. And it's absolutely necessary. It's absolutely necessary. One of the arguments we heard was that the term sex should cover trans people. It doesn't. And I'll let Martine and Morgan talk about that. But suffice to say, we're dealing with the most marginalized group, period. I argued in my book, which won the Lambda in Washington, D.C., about this journey, that that trans folk throughout the world now are the most marginalized of the marginal. And you just need two stats in this country to see that that's true. Number one, a 50% living below the poverty line rate, and number two, a 50% attempted suicide rate. Those two stats tell you all you need to know about why trans rights are human rights and why we need to be active in all jurisdictions, not just federal, provincial. All the provinces need to come on board with their own changes, but throughout the world, in fact. So with that, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Martine?
Yes. Well, good morning, everybody. And good morning, Sherry, and good morning.
Good morning.
Yes. So it's been a long struggle for the trans community, and I'll take us back to 1998. And the trans community then was a very quiet community. They really didn't have much of a voice, and we're just trying to get along and get by. But an event happened that year on October 1st, 1998, when the Mike Harris Conservative government sneakily delisted funding for sex reassignment surgery without any consultation from the Gender Identity Clinic, without any consultation with doctors or anything on the impact that would have to us and our community. I was halfway through the procedure at the time, and I was just in the process of getting my appointment for the final approval for surgery, and before I could get that appointment, the funding was cut, which meant it left me in between. I spent about a year lobbying, speaking to politicians, and trying to fight to get our surgery funded again. A chance meeting with the someone from the Ontario Human Rights Commission when I was making a submission to the Canadian Human Rights Review Panel, which were taking submissions to changes for the Canadian Human Rights Act. And I gave a list of 30 recommendations and gave a speech in October of 1999. And someone from the Ontario Human Rights Commission approached me. I gave them the recommendations as well, which some of it became part of their policy paper that was released in May 2000 on gender identity. I explained the situation that I was in, and he suggested that I should try launching a human rights case, of which I did in that month. So I approached a lawyer I had met at a union conference earlier, and her name was Susan Ursel, and we launched this case or filed it in January of 2000. The case itself ended up taking 8 years. 4 of that 8 years was involved with tribunal hearings. We had about 27 dates, including a break where the government wanted to negotiate with us, and we almost had an agreement in 2004 on getting sex reassignment surgery relisted and making gains in the community. But at the last second, Dalton McGuinty pulled pulled the rug out from under us, and our meeting to, basically sign the papers was canceled. I can sort of understand why he did this, because we would have signed off on this 3 weeks after they delisted funding for chiropractic eye exams and put that health tax on. So it would have been a little difficult to explain why they're relisting this after doing that. But it was a shock to us, and we had to go and continue with the human rights case. And in the end, in November 2006, we got the decision on that. 3 of the 4 of us, there were 4 complainants in the case. 3 of them were added just before the tribunal's hearing started in 2003. So 3 of the 4 of us were covered for our surgeries. The 4th person was not, and it didn't recommend listing the surgery for everybody in the province. So that meant the 4th person in the case launched an appeal, and Susan Gapka and I went to work lobbying to get our surgery back. Now, Susan and I met up in 2000 through the Rainbow Health Network, and she was starting the Trans Health Lobby Group with Rupert Raj at that time, and I became part of that group at that time. And we tirelessly went to like crashed liberal barbecues or spoke to politicians and everybody we could speak to. And I would literally run up to people and tell them, look, we need our surgery and everything. Can you support us in getting our funding for our surgery? Well, along the way, towards the end, we approached Sherry DeNovo. And I remember talking to you, Sherry, and I was asking if you could help us with getting funding for our surgery. And you said that your party does support us and would gladly support any effort to do that, but to ask for something that the public has to fund, like monetary-wise, that you couldn't do that. So I thought about it for a minute, and I thought, well, if we can't do that, if we can't, perhaps maybe we should try to get our human rights, which is what led to Toby's bill. That's when we brought that forward, and that was, I think, in 2005. And so we started lobbying also for our rights, getting gender identity into the Human Rights Code, and then we thought about it more, and we wanted to get gender expression in to cover the whole broad spectrum. In the meantime, we were still fighting to get the surgery back for everybody in the province, and another 2 years of lobbying. In 2008, George Smitherman, who was the health minister during this time, upon stepping down as health minister, one of the last things he did was to relist sex reassignment surgery for everybody in the province, which became, was funded again as of June 21st, 2008. So that was a big victory. So then we set our sights then on getting gender identity into the Human Rights Code. And I remember we had a meeting with the Attorney General, I'm trying to think of his name now, not Michael Bryant, the one after him. Just before, Chris Bentley, yeah. And, we had a panel of, Rainbow Health Ontario, the Trans Pulse Project, Trans Lobby Group, people from the community. I just forget how many, but we gave a lot of really impressive stories. But one of the things I said that sort of stuck on them was the fact that it doesn't cost them anything to change the code and add us in, but it's costing them endless amounts of money for the amount of cases that we have to keep bringing forward, either human rights cases or court cases and so on, due to discrimination against us, which ties up the system. So they sort of got that, but they didn't really acknowledge much about personal stories or anything. And Chris Bentley was not to be budged. He was firmly against putting gender identity as its own separate code. He felt that we were protected under the ground of sex, which we really aren't. So it wasn't until after Chris Bentley left and we got John Gerritsen as the Attorney General that I think things changed in that way. But also, after Sherry had tabled this bill 3 times, I mean, we were thinking that, you know, it didn't look like we were going to get anywhere with it. But we convinced Sherry to try a 4th time. And this time, with our lobbying, we were able to get Christine Elliott from the Conservatives to endorse it, and Yasser Naqvi. And that has to do with lobbying and meeting with politicians and just getting out there and doing things. And what I want to tell everybody in this room here is that one person can make a difference in this world, just with determination. And you know, every one of you can be an activist for your causes. I mean, if we can take something like sex reassignment surgery in 1998 and fight to get that relisted, and fight for 12 years to get gender identity and gender expression into the Ontario Human Rights Code, I mean, we all can make a difference in this world. As a result of getting gender identity and gender expression into the Ontario Human Rights Code, Manitoba followed suit about 3 weeks later, and now Nova Scotia has also put it into their Human Rights Code. There's some talk about BC, which since 1998, they nearly had it in their code, but they dismantled the Human Rights Commission out there, and the bill died. There's been a couple of private members' bills that have died since then, but BC tends to closely follow what Ontario does. And now that we have it in our code, there's a good chance, I think, in the next couple of years, BC should have it in their code, I would hope. We still have extensive lobbying to do in many provinces to get our rights. New Brunswick has absolutely no protection for trans people whatsoever, has never funded surgeries or has any medical help for trans people. Newfoundland, it's not in their code either, or Yukon or Nunavut. But believe it or not, the first place to have gender identity protection was the Northwest Territories. And that was in, what was it, 2003, something like that. Yeah, and that was largely in part of EGAL Canada, who had noticed that they were taking suggestions for their human rights code, and they wrote them a letter, and apparently they added it in there. But of all places, Northwest Territories. City of Toronto has had gender identity in their code since the early 90s. I work for the Toronto District School Board. I've been with them for 30 years. In 1999, in November, I went to one of their board meetings where they were debating their first human rights policy, and I outed myself to them to get gender identity into their code for the protection of the students and staff, and we were the first school board in Canada to have such protection. Yeah, it's been a fight, but we got there, and you know, we're not finished yet. As I say, we have to fight across Canada now, but here in Ontario, what we're looking at is improvements to healthcare. So multiple assessor sites so that we don't have to go to the gender identity clinic, more services throughout rural Ontario for trans people, so we're not forced to come to the GTA, and educating the public, basically, to lessen discrimination. It's one thing if you put something into the code, but you can't stop there. You have to educate, educate, educate. Anyways, I guess that's what I have to say, and I'll just say one last thing about the bathroom bill that you brought up. I think that all these people that are thinking of the bathroom bill and using that against us, they need to get their head out of the toilet and come to the 21st century. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Are we all good? Great. So my name is Morgan M. Page, and I'm the Trans Community Services Coordinator at the 519 Church Street Community Center, where I provide services to marginalized trans people, trans youth, and trans sex workers. I'm also a well-known trans activist and a performance and video artist on the side, not to mention snazzy dresser. I woke up this morning, I was putting on clothes, and I was like, oh, balls, I have to go to like Osgood Hall. I have to wear something professional. And then I just put on what I normally wear, but I added suspenders, and I was like, that's totally professional enough to go there. It's going to be great, don't worry. I want to start by thanking both Sherry and Martine and Susan Gapka, who unfortunately couldn't be here, for their tireless efforts over the years in all of the things they've done for trans people. I really value those things. I am about to provide a counterpoint, though. So while I acknowledge that the securing of gender identity and gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code was a noble cause, and that a great deal of people, including my fellow panelists, put in an incredible amount of work to achieve this, I have to say that I don't believe these provisions will have significant impact on the lives of the majority of the trans people that I work with. It's not like you get human rights and then you're like, oh, I have human rights now, I can just like go about my life. It doesn't actually work that way. Human rights codes aren't a panacea for all of the problems that we face in society. The problem with the human rights framework, or one of the problems, is that it's very difficult to enforce, right? So if I go for a job interview and they know that I'm trans, either by looking at me or if I disclose for whatever reason, I mean, I don't usually go, hi, I'm Morgan, I'm trans, let me tell you about my vagina. But let's say I do disclose for some reason and I don't get the job. How can I prove that this was because I'm trans and not for any number of other reasons? This is the problem my clients, as well as my friends and my trans family, run into constantly, is that we face discrimination and then we're like, oh, I'm gonna file a human rights thing. And then we go to the human rights thing and they're like, oh, actually you have no evidence and there's nothing we can do. Unfortunately, those forms of insidious discrimination can't be addressed adequately through a human rights framework, and that's where we see the majority of discrimination. Another question to be asked of the human rights framework is, who has the time, energy, and resources to follow through on a human rights claim? Marginalized trans women, trans people of color, and trans sex workers who bear the highest burden of discrimination often don't have the time, energy, or resources to go through the human rights process. We can see that most people who will successfully make use of these protections will be of a slim minority of a very specific kind of trans person. I can paint you a picture. They're probably white, they're probably older, they probably transitioned later in life, have been employed for most of their lives, maybe not currently. I mean, we are talking about someone who's being discriminated against. Probably educated, probably come from a middle-class background. A human rights framework also, unfortunately, does nothing to address the crisis of housing, employment, healthcare, and education for trans people in Canada. They're very nice words on fine paper. I'll address what I think we need legally in a moment, but some other concrete, real-life things that we need are a dedicated shelter for trans people. No dedicated shelter exists, and trans people, especially trans women, are regularly turned away from shelters, both women's shelters, co-ed gender shelters, and men's shelters. We also need dedicated supportive housing and subsidized housing units for trans people. Without these, like, how can we do anything but continue to live in a cycle of going from street to shelter, street to shelter, street to shelter? We need the next step, and that next step doesn't exist right now. Or it doesn't exist in a reasonable way. It kind of exists if you want to wait like 3 years on a waiting list to maybe get subsidized housing, but you're probably not going to get it. And then if you do get it, your landlord's probably going to be really transphobic or like the super you're building. This happens to people I work with constantly. We also need the Ministry of Health to follow through on their promise, as Martine was speaking about a moment ago, to open additional assessor sites for trans people to access OHIP funding for surgeries. A few years ago, as Martine was speaking about, the Ministry of Health promised us 3 additional assessor sites would be opened in Ontario. They have not followed through on this promise. Currently, you have to go to CAMH's Gender Identity Clinic, which is notorious around the world in trans communities for being like the worst place you could ever go. They are well known for exploiting their patients regularly. They use a bunch of techniques that they took from their pedophilia clinic and apply them to trans people. So, which also happens to be on the same floor, so you have to wait in a waiting room with, you know, pedophiles. Totally welcoming for trans people. I couldn't see a problem with that. Not a problem at all. So we really need the Ministry of Health to follow through on this. And we need for that funding to be extended to other procedures, including breast augmentation. Currently, the only procedures funded for trans women are bottom surgeries, so an orchiectomy, the removal of the testicles, or vaginoplasty, the creation of a vagina. And for trans men, they can have top surgery, the creation of a male chest, and various forms of bottom surgery. Trans women obviously only get the one kind of surgery. Why is that discrimination happening? Maybe because people care more about men. I'm just saying. In addition, again, as Martine was talking about, we need more trans-inclusive primary healthcare providers, especially in rural areas. My job actually only extends to the city of Toronto, but you know where I get the most requests from? Everywhere outside of Toronto. I have people in North Bay going, like writing me emails and calling me on the phone and sometimes showing up at my office. They come all the way to Toronto just to come to my office to track me down, to ask me, where can I find a healthcare provider? Like basic healthcare. And you know what I have to say to them? Sorry, not in your area. There's nothing. In addition to that, we really, really, really need for emergency healthcare providers like hospitals to be trans-inclusive across the province. Currently, if you're a trans person, I mean, I know for me it's a big thing, for most of the people I know, we really don't want to break a leg or something, because then you're going to have to go to an emergency room, especially if it's an emergency room outside of Toronto. When you enter those kinds of situations, people have been turned away, people get made fun of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I actually had my friend and mentor die as a result of mistreatment in an emergency room. He was genderqueer, and he was an epileptic, and every time he would go to the hospital, they would laugh at him, and they would get other nurses and doctors to come into the room to see the freak. And one night he had a particularly bad seizure, and he refused to go to the hospital because he just couldn't be laughed at one more time. And then he died. So we really, really need this stuff. While the human rights legislation in theory will take care of these issues, we can't rest on our laurels about it, you know? We have to actually take that and put it into practice. Now on to the legal things that we need. This is a law conference, so I thought about the law a little bit, and I'm maybe a little involved in the law. The biggest priorities I see for trans activism in Canada are maybe kind of controversial, so I hope you'll bear with me, but I have a really good logic for all of them, I promise. The first is the full decriminalization of sex work in Canada. Trans people, especially trans women, are disproportionately involved in all areas of sex work because, frankly, it's hard to get a job when you're trans. And while bottom surgery is covered in Ontario for people who have OHIP, remember, not everyone in this province has OHIP. Other surgeries are not covered, such as breast augmentation, facial feminization surgery, et cetera, not to mention the cost of hormones. All of these things add up to be really expensive, especially when you add it on top of our basic living expenses. So that's why a lot of people use sex work. So the lack of job options and high cost of surgeries create a situation where anywhere from the very low estimate, according to Trans Pulse, of 15% of trans women to most other studies, which point to about 40% of trans women are involved in sex work at some point in their lives. As well, those who have fled violence in their home countries to settle in Canada might not have status here and may only be able to rely on so-called underground economies, such as sex work, to put food on the table, to send money home to family in their home countries, and also to pay for surgeries and hormones. Not only is it hard to get a job for trans people in general, particularly for trans people of color who face the highest rates of discrimination, it becomes even harder when you factor in having a criminal record for sex work, right? Police target trans sex workers for arrest and violence. If we decriminalize sex work, we will undoubtedly make a significant positive impact on the lives of many trans people. So that's one, and I hope you followed me so far. Two, maybe more controversial. Let's just go there. The second biggest priority, I believe, has to do with HIV. Trans women are greatly affected by HIV and AIDS. According to statistics released by the Public Health Agency of Canada, trans women in Canada have an HIV rate, or seroprevalence, of 27%, making us one of the most affected populations in the country. Just to put that into perspective, you know how we think like HIV, we think men who have sex with men, right? So men who have sex with men in downtown Toronto have a seroprevalence of only 24%. We're 3% above them across the country without looking at specifics of location, racial background, risk behavior, et cetera, right? So if we looked more specifically at, say, trans women who do sex work, or trans women of color, or trans women from endemic nations, et cetera, we would see much higher rates than 27%. You look at a study from Atlanta, Georgia, among trans sex workers found 68% were HIV positive. So very important to trans people. As people involved in the law, I would hope that you're all aware that HIV non-disclosure is illegal in Canada, with charges of aggravated sexual assault and attempted murder used against people living with HIV. In October, the Supreme Court made the very unfortunate decision to not listen to science. Before this happened, you could not disclose if you either used a condom or had a low viral load. Or an undetectable viral load. So like the amount of HIV in your blood is undetectable. Both of these are scientifically proven to make the risk for transmission of HIV negligible. They've ruled now that you must both use a condom and have a lower undetectable viral load. Where did I go? And it has to be at the time the sex occurred. So you can't like have a month ago know that you have a low viral load. You have to know like on the day that your viral load is gonna be really low. So I propose that the Government of Canada produce at its own expense instant viral load testing and used condom collection kits. Since we don't know who has and who doesn't have HIV, they should of course make sure that these are freely provided to all persons within the country. And because we don't know how often people are having sex or where they're having sex, these should be available in all locations in unlimited quantities at all time. Like, there should be some strapped to the bottom of all your chairs like this is Oprah and you just won a truck. But I digress. The thing about this law is that many people who are charged actually did disclose or claim that they did disclose. It's very hard to prove that you disclosed, though, because all the person has to say is they didn't disclose, right? Think about it. You're law students. Not that difficult. So what we see, very unfortunately, is that a lot of people who did disclose are being charged by abusive ex-partners who just want to get revenge on them, right? And even more unfortunately, once you start the process of charging someone with HIV non-disclosure, you can't stop it. So there are a lot of people who, in a fit of anger, will call the police and be like, oh, I'm going to tell the police you didn't disclose. And the police will get a hold of that information. And then if the person later feels guilty about it and goes to the police, and this has happened several times, and they're like, oh, I actually, you know what, they did disclose, I'm sorry, like blah, 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 or it's not a big deal. The police won't stop that. They will continue with the prosecution. It's also kind of hilarious that, or like, not hilarious, but unfortunate that being charged with aggravated sexual assault, you are way more likely to be convicted if it's because of HIV non-disclosure than if it was an actual aggravated sexual assault. That's a whole other issue. This law creates an environment in which people don't want to be tested for HIV because if you're tested, then you're liable, right? I talk to my program participants about this constantly, and they say, I don't want to get tested, then I can't do sex work. How am I going to make money? How am I going to eat? How am I going to have surgery? What am I going to do, right? And in addition to that, folks who are getting tested are even more afraid of disclosing because it's like that anxiety that if I can just get through this encounter and then I never have to see this person again and nothing bad will happen to me. But if I say something, then something bad could happen to me. So it discourages testing. It discourages disclosure. It's bad law that creates the exact opposite effect it's intended to do. The third priority, have you followed me all so far? Okay, third one, last one, I promise. And then maybe we'll have questions or something. The third priority has to do with policing and prisons. Trans women in Canada are subject to a great deal of police harassment and violence, especially trans women of color, due to the criminalization of sex work and HIV and the stereotype of trans women being sex workers. Police regularly stop and harass trans women on the street, a phenomenon referred to as walking while trans. They may use condoms we have in our purses or somewhere on our persons as evidence of sex work and abusively arrest trans women who are simply walking home. Not to mention all the trans women who are doing sex work, which itself is technically legal in Canada. Whole other issue. So in addition to that, once arrested, trans women are put in jail cells and prison cells with men where they face high rates of violence and especially sexual violence. The only other option for trans prisoners is to be put into solitary confinement for an extended period of time, which has been ruled by the United Nations to be a form of torture. And it also opens us up to potential abuse from corrections officers. Trans women prisoners in solitary have reported quite regularly being raped by corrections officers or having them piss in their food on a regular basis. As well, once inside, the prisons freeze trans people where they're at, in theory. So the theory is that once you enter prison, if you're already on hormones, you can stay on hormones. If you're not on hormones, you can never have them. If you want to have surgery, you can't have surgery. Now, this doesn't always work out. Often people will enter prisons and not be given access to their hormone medication. To put that into a little bit of perspective, as a post-operative trans woman, if I was put into prison and someone took me off my hormones, this could open me up to breast cancer, to osteoporosis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because my body doesn't produce its own hormones anymore. Those hormones are life-saving for me. Without those hormones, I go into menopause, and going into menopause when you're like 26, maybe not the best thing in the long run for your body, right? In addition, going on and off hormones in a very erratic way, no matter what stage in transition you may be at, is very dangerous for your body, especially when it is not under proper doctor supervision, which is very hard to get in prisons. There have been a very few exceptional cases in which trans people have been able to access surgery from the inside, but this is not across the board. It is extremely difficult. It's quite the uphill battle. So basically, we can't forget the trans people who are on the inside right now. We must fight for their right to be free from violence, abuse, and isolation. And that's going to take a lot more than human rights protections. We have to get next level about this. We've got our human rights protections now. That's wonderful. How do we take this next level? How do we make this something that actually has a real impact on people's lives? So that's what I have to say.
Wonderful. Thanks, Morgan, and thanks to all the panelists. It was amazing how well they worked together to give us a sense of what's been accomplished and the struggles that lie ahead. And we now have a little more than 15 minutes for conversation. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are mobile microphones in the room, and I'll bring them around. I would just ask that each of the speakers, commentators, introduce yourself to the room. So open for questions and comments.
Hello, my name is Sherelle. Are we supposed to be saying where we're from, or just? Okay. Well, I was going to say it anyway. I'm coming from Western today, and I've spoken to someone else who's in my first year class. I'm in first year. So he was a former police officer, and he's now in law school. So and he's very open to questions, and I actually asked him about transgender people and what happens when they get arrested or something, and he said now he was I'm more not educated or open-minded than a lot of other police officers, because he's at law school, and he said a lot of them don't like lawyers generally, just as a first point. But he said a lot of them just don't know. They don't understand what's going on. So instead of trying to educate themselves, they're afraid, and they just do what you've described, they do, which I think personally is a horrible thing, but they don't understand. So I guess my long-winded question later is, how do we how can you bring that knowledge to the police force or to these other groups that are discriminating? Because I think it stems from a fear of the unknown instead of necessarily hate. So
I'm a member of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and I'm on both their Ontario and National Pink Triangle committees. I'm their trans rep. Over the years, I've fought to educate CUPE, of which our members are in hospitals, and we have the Hospital Employees Union is connected with CUPE, and we're also trying to educate other unions as well, such as OPSU, I think, is in the prisons, I think, on educating the prison guards and the staff in there on trans people and their needs, and the discrimination they face and dangers they face in the prison system, and again in the hospitals, educating nurses and so on, so that these types of exploitation that happen to trans people in hospitals don't happen, so they get treated with respect. In the case of Mount Sinai Hospital now has a trans policy, and the University Health Network is developing a trans policy as well, and educating their members as well. So hopefully we shall see in the next several years. It's going to take a while to educate, but we slowly have to get in there and make change. And through the unions, we can do that, union to union, and strength and solidarity together.
Yeah, I just want to say the Toronto Police Force, can't speak for the others, but Toronto Police Force is supposed to have, they've got LBGT officers, first of all, and they're supposed to have a sensitivity training portion of their training. Now, you can hear from Morgan that that doesn't always hit the streets, but again, you know, this is a process. I just wanted to respond to some of what Morgan said, because I agree with everything she said. The problem of enforcement, first of all, the bigger picture, everybody in this province, if you want affordable housing, 10 to 12 year wait, 170,000 families. So trans are part of that, but everybody waits for affordable housing. We've got out of the housing business. Healthcare ditto, 1 in 10 Ontarians has a GP. So trans people are part of that. It's awful. Healthcare and education. Education, I don't need to tell you people how much you're paying in your yearly dues. Trans people are part of that. We have the highest per capita student tuition fees in Canada and the lowest investment per student in Canada. We're 10th out of 10. Should be proud for everybody. But enforcement of the Human Rights Code, enforcement of employment standards. I'm the gal that brought in the $10 minimum wage. And I can tell you that there's lots of people still not making minimum wage in this province. We don't have enforcement of anything in this province. That's a good way of looking at it. So as lawyers, when you go out there, and certainly it's not uniform enforcement, and certainly it's not enlightened enforcement, 1 in 100 employers ever sees anyone from employment standards, for example. And this is true independent of the code, independent of the policy. If there's no enforcement, you might as well not have a change. So it's a huge uphill battle we have in this province to just get the very basics enforced. And you, whatever kind of law you end up in, you will come across this over and over again. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is David Morris. I actually work with I'm not a lawyer, I'm the executive assistant to the Children's Lawyer for Ontario, who is Susan's wife, Lucy McSweeney, Susan Ursul's wife.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I just, when you said the name, I was like, oh yeah, I know it. And I'm also on the board for the Ontario Public Service Pride Network. I'm trying to decide who my question is for, if it's for Morgan or if it's for Martine. Maybe I'd appreciate hearing both your opinions on this. With the success of Toby's Law, though, do you not see now that there's a great opportunity in applying that legislation to some of the other concerns that Morgan raised? As far as like a go-forward item, like now that we have this in the Human Rights Code, that more cases can now come forward with this piece of the puzzle in place to now address these other issues?
I certainly think that getting gender identity and gender expression into the Human Rights Code gives us finally a platform of which we can work on. See, the struggle was getting our rights in the code so that we had sort of like a stepping stone to go forward. Now we've got that stepping stone. Now we can expand on that. And just what Morgan was saying there, this gives us a better opportunity now to work on getting things like better housing, shelters, improving our health care, improving our rights in general. I mean, without this, it was a struggle to make any headway in any of these. But now that we've got something that says we're protected by the law, and some of these things, these barriers that we still face do form discrimination, we can use that to bring ourselves forward. So it's not going to happen overnight. It took us 12 years to get gender identity, gender expression into the Ontario Human Rights Code. So I expect it's probably going to take, another 10 years or so to make some headway. But all we have to do is keep plugging away at it piece by piece, and each piece of the puzzle is going to come together. And I just want to say, when I was talking about Susan Ursel, if it wasn't for her, the human rights case would not have happened. She did this case pro bono. And I also have to thank CUPE Ontario for paying the disbursements in the case, which is about $10,000, and my local CUPE 4400 for the 27 book-off dates I needed for the case. So these things all came together to make this case work. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to afford it. This government spent about $1.25 million fighting us. And think of how many surgeries that would have covered when they only spent about, male to female, about 20,000 each, a limit of about 5 a year, right? So, Morgan?
Two things. First, one, to address the first question. Okay, it's totally not helpful, but the activist in me just says about police, just burn it down and salt the earth. Like, but realistically, obviously, we need to do continued education for all police forces across the province. And this education has to start in police foundations college courses. And then it has to continue every single year because there's a high turnover rate, and also people don't want to remember things that they don't like over time. And then furthermore, enforcement on the force. Police officers, this is the biggest problem with changing things in police, is that they don't want to report each other, and they don't want to address issues that are reported to them. We need to make the police accountable to the communities that they serve. So that's one thing. Then as for this, I would hope that we'd be able to leverage human rights legislation to attain some of the goals that I've talked about. Do I think that's realistic? Not at this present time. It's kind of like, remember how we got gay marriage? And then everyone was like, oh my God, homophobia is over. And then like no one wanted to do anything anymore. And EGAL went from having like 50 employees to having 1 employee. The exact same thing is happening in the trans community right now, where we're like, oh, we have rights now. And suddenly all of the people who have any amount of privilege are really not interested in trans issues anymore. And furthermore, are really not interested in looking at how HIV and sex work are key in the social determinants of health of trans people. So I don't think the gender identity and gender expression is going to have a significant impact on the decriminalization of sex work or of HIV non-disclosure. I hope that maybe it will have an effect on the way trans people are treated in prison, but I'm not going to hold my breath for it. So that's just my opinion.
If I could just add a comment of my own. I just wanted to really express my gratitude for the work that you, Sherry, and you, Martine, and you, Morgan, have done. It's really amazing what you're accomplishing, and we're really grateful for it all. And I just want to say a few words about the ways in which it connects with what we do. Because I've been really struck listening to you in thinking about how your own struggles are so closely connected to what we are doing. Those of us here, I think many of us are either law professors or lawyers or law students. And it's really helpful to hear your account of your experiences, because we're working on the same issues from a different place. And I think we probably need to hear from each other a little more often. And there's a number of ways in which, OSGA, for example, my law school, is very closely connected to the struggles that you've all been involved in. And it does take time, I agree with you, Morgan, but I think the change is going to come. And for example, when I think of some of the key rulings in Ontario, we already talked about the Hogan case that Martine was involved in. A former student of mine, Patricia DeGuire, was one of the members of the panel in that case. There's probably people in the room today who will someday be the judges or tribunal members who are dealing with some of the issues that we're talking about now and trying to give effect to gender identity and discrimination on the basis of gender identity and gender expression in a way that will hopefully do a better job of addressing some of the issues and moving the issues forward, although I agree human rights isn't a panacea, but it's a really important part of the struggle. And the XY decision from last year that changed the requirement in the Vital Statistics Act that one had to go through surgery before one could get a change in the birth certificate, a change in the gender in the birth certificate was, I think, a very powerful opinion that advanced the law in the area in a very significant way and was written by Sherry Price, who again is an Osgoode grad, and doesn't seem like it was that long ago she was in my constitutional law class. And David Wrights, he's the chair of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, wrote, I thought, a very good decision towards the end of last year in a case called Vanderputten, where Maria Vanderputten was a trans woman who had gone through all kinds of harassment and experienced a poisoned work environment and was fired from her job and got a very strong ruling from the HRTO with an award of damages of $22,000 for violation of her dignity and self-respect, and also damages for lost wages. And David's someone who also has a connection to Osgoode, has taught here as an adjunct professor. And I just wanted to comment, Morgan, on your point about the difficulties of proving discrimination. And that's an issue that a lot of us who work in the area are thinking about all the time. We have a number of students who work in various clinical programs here at Osgoode, and one is the Anti-Discrimination Intensive Program, where 6 students every semester are placed at the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and they're probably fielding the calls from some of the people you talked about who are concerned about the discrimination they've experienced and seeking to establish or find out whether they'll be able to bring a successful application in the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And I think it's really important that the students who are working there, and some of them are here in the room, they know what you're talking about, but they're also anxious to help document those experiences and figure out how we can document them in a way that will make for a viable application to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And I think there are real opportunities, as I said, for activists and the lawyers and students who are involved in fighting these issues to work together and figuring out how to make them viable applications that can help make a small contribution to the kinds of change you were discussing.
Totally, and Osgoode was super involved in the sex work decriminalization case too, right? Yeah. With Alan Young, which is still ongoing, and we're going to hear about very soon. I'm very excited about it. Any other questions?
So my question, well, first of all, my name's Jennifer Leung, and I'm a third-year law student at U of T. My question was about kind of implementing kind of improved access to healthcare, kind of multiple assessor sites, and also rural healthcare for trans individuals, kind of given how kind of physician-centered the Ontario health system is, and how subjective, say, a standard for whether or not, say, hormones or sex reassignment surgery would even be medically indicated. Because I feel like we have this system where an individual doctor might just feel like, oh, I just don't think this is medically indicated, I just don't think this is in your best interest, and this is a much bigger issue for trans youth who are transitioning as teenagers. And there's just no kind of legal recourse, right? There's no way to judicially review your doctor's decision if they just don't want to prescribe you something. So I guess, do you see the Human Rights Code as a way to kind of break that protective barrier around physician discretion, or what other types of legal recourse could you use?
Well, one thing I would say about that is that if, for example, we did try and take a doctor to court, I mean, first of all, you should know that doctors have a right to refuse. They don't have to if they're not comfortable with that kind of medicine, they can actually tell you no, and that's okay, technically. But the one thing I would say is that if a trans person tried to take this, for example, to the Human Rights Tribunal, unfortunately, due to the Government of Ontario's sponsorship of the CAMH Gender Identity Clinic, they would just say that the trans person has to go to the Gender Identity Clinic, which is a huge problem because they regularly withhold hormones and surgery from people who don't meet their standards. So I don't think following like a human rights tribunal frame would be super helpful. You had something to say?
I was just going to say that we're the only province that doesn't have ombudsman oversight over our hospitals even. So you cannot appeal beyond the bounds of a hospital to an ombudsman who has long since asked for oversight over the mush factor generally. We don't have that in Ontario. So I'd say that's number one. We have no place to appeal. And number two, I'm not so sure you couldn't use it. But again, what I think Morgan has hit on is the problem is it's always the whistleblower. It's always the person who has to put themselves forward, usually hire a lawyer, take some action. This is an onerous road. And we have to, and this is the enforcement angle. So, it's like, say, women's rights. I mean, we got the vote. Was that a fight worth having? Absolutely. Do women still make 71 cents on the dollar for every dollar a man makes? Absolutely. So, the framework of the human rights, framework of policy, is great. Now we have to build a house. And the house is, how do we put that into effect? And that's what I think we're all talking about here. So we need to do something, especially where human rights is concerned, the way the tribunal is set up right now, that makes it easier for somebody to get justice. I mean, we have to do something in the justice system to make it easier for people to get justice. We just won the West End Legal Clinic, was about to be closed. You know how hard it is to get a lawyer, if you don't have money. So, I mean, this is a really, really big issue, and it's one we can work on together. Pro bono is a good start.
Well, if you don't have money, you can always hire Joe Arve, because he'll work for free.
Well, I always say if it's free, it's me. So
we've gone a few minutes over, but I think we can take one last question from Mark.
Sorry, I thank you very much for your talk. I came in midway through, so I hope my question is not repeating something that you already raised beforehand. But Professor Ryder raised the XY decision on birth certificates. In fact, that was a really positive decision where people in the area were happy about it, and then the government came back with the new legislation on it, and not legislation, but new policy on it rather. And it wasn't worse, but certainly was very problematic still. So I was just looking at ways in which you can make if we on the justice side you got institutional positive elements, in the legal side, but in order to make sure that it's responsive on the political level and to make sure that political leaders are attuned to what it's like, I was just wondering your comments on that to make that part of the system much more responsive to trans needs.
I was actually involved in that a little bit. So when that came through, the government was all like, oh crap, we have to change our policy. So they sent out like an email to a few well-known transes, and I was one of them. And they basically asked us like, what do you actually want? Well, it's definitely not perfect, and I think it should be improved. I was surprised to see that the majority of my recommendations were taken into account in the new policy. One of the most unfortunate places they were not taken into account was that the age is still 18, whereas I think it should be lowered. I recommended 16 to be all conservative because I was like, oh, maybe they'll be into that. But I really think any age, like if you are 5, let's get on it. Yeah, so I think making sure that those kinds of accountability processes happen when these decisions go through, that like the community is actually consulted is super important. I think that decision is actually one of the only times I've seen that happen for the trans community, where the government has been forced to make a change and they've actually come to us to decide what the change was. So that is, when that happens, we have an open dialogue. And so if it turned out they did something really messed up, like really far from what I said, I could have emailed that person back and been like, who the hell are you and what the hell do you think you're doing? But less polite. You never want to get an email from me. Oh my God, all caps. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say don't wait, because
Yeah.
this woman here, Martine and Susan Gapka, don't wait for the government to come to you. You go to the government.
Yeah.
I was intimately involved in that. I talked to John Gerritsen, who's the Attorney General. First, as soon as Toby's Law passed, I said, okay, what about ID? And so that's my access. I can talk to John. I just met him last week about a whole slew of things, including West End Legal Clinic, SLAP suits, all sorts of stuff I want to see action on. If I hear from you, that's how I know it's an issue that's in the community. Martine and Susan and the Trans Health Lobby have been at Queen's Park all the time, talking to politicians, lobbying politicians, and they've been phenomenally effective. So, you know, you don't have to have money, as I said up front. Just make sure your voice is heard. Don't wait for the government. My goodness, you'll wait forever. Be your own advocate. Yeah.
I just want to say it's changing the Vital Statistics Act here in Ontario for trans people. I believe that we are only the second jurisdiction in the world to have that. The other one is in England, which was the Gender Recognition Act, which was passed in 2005, which allowed people to claim their gender and legally change their sex on their gender without having to go through surgery. And basically there you had to have a letter from a family doctor, from a psychiatrist, and show that you had been living, I think, for a year or so in your gender that had been established, and then you could go to a judge and have your gender changed with the usual government fees. But I don't know of any other jurisdiction other than Ontario that has changed vital statistics to allow trans people to have surgery or to have their identification changed to their gender of who they express themselves to be without having to have surgery. There are some people who can't have surgery for medical reasons.
Or don't want to.
Or don't want to for personal reasons. And it is completely inhumane to leave them with a document that doesn't express who they are, and when they're forced to show this document to authorities or whatever, it creates like an embarrassing and intimidating situation. So I applaud the government for actually not appealing this and going forward and coming to the trans community. We got a copy of that questionnaire too, and we debated it in our group and responded to them. And they made the changes, and I applaud the government for doing that. So I'm hoping that that has a similar effect on other provinces and jurisdictions here in North America. It seems like we've gone from being backward in 1998 to losing our surgery, becoming the leaders in North America in trans. But we can't stop. We still have a long way to go. If you heard from Morgan, we have a lot of issues still that need to be addressed. And we still have the public we have to address too, because the public still does not understand trans people. You ask people, they have a little better opinion now than they had of the Jerry Springer show, but I mean, we still have a ways to go, such as workplace harassment and so on. We just have to keep plugging away at it.
Absolutely, and that seems like a perfect place to stop. Thank you all, Sherry, Martine, Morgan. It's been wonderful to hear from you today.